waterboard non-terrorists in order to save American cities from nuclear attacks. Is this morally acceptable or not? These are also decisions, but at least at the surface look very, very different. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to show you a series of results and ideas from my field to ask you to think about the following question. How are moral choices, like the previous two that I showed you, different from the simple burrito with or without chicken decision that you just made? Are these fundamentally different for your brain or not? We certainly treat them in public discourse as if they are. And maybe that's the right thing to do, but I want to show you some thoughts, some things that we have found over the years on this in my lab. So to be able to really address this question, to have a good conversation as a group, I need to give you the world's fastest primer on the neuroeconomics of simple choice. And then I will jump to the comparison with moral choice, which is why we're here. So I just want to give you some ideas of things that we have found in my lab and are found in many, many labs across the world. So the first one is that you made simple choices extremely fast, on the order of 1 to 4 seconds, okay? And there is a signal that gets computed in your brain in an area called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's about an inch behind where my finger is, that seems to encode a value signal at the time of decision that is driving the process of choice. If the value that gets encoded in that area is high, you tend to say yes or value a lot the choice. If it's very low, you do the opposite. Okay? And this is a very, very robust finding across food choices, monetary choices, given to others, etc. So we know that these simple value choices depend on how your brain encodes the value of the thing at the time of choice. Now, more interestingly, there is a question of where these values come from. It could be the case that you decided to approach the burrito because this area had a appetitive, highly appetitive signal. But where did this signal came from? Did it just retrieve from memory? Did it just, you were born with a taste for burritos? It turns out that across a very wide class of choices, the genetic algorithm that your brain is using to make choices looks like attribute computation, value assignment, and integration. So, this is a laser pointer in the middle? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So imagine that I ask you, do you want to eat that ice cream, yes or no? Okay, and you eventually are going to assign a value to ice cream, not apple. I'm sorry, there's a typo there. And that, if that is the value signal that gets encoded in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. If it's high, you're going to say yes. If it's low, you're going to say no. Now, the idea is that the way the brain does that extremely fast and unconsciously, it's going to abstract attributes out of this. And for the purpose of example, I'm making this quick. I'm just telling you, maybe your brain is keeping track of how tasty it would be to eat this and how healthy it would be to eat this. It's going to assign value to each one of those attributes based on what you think and you have learned in the past the value of each of these attributes are, and they're going to integrate it back into a net value signal that drives your choice. That's how the value signal gets constructed. More importantly, and relevant for today, the choices that you make are going to depend on how you represent these attributes and weight them. So for example, if you're someone who thinks that this is tasty and unhealthy, okay? Many of you are not in the age group where you still have to think this is unhealthy. I am, okay? But if you are someone like that and you weigh both things equally, you will say, okay, maybe taste, value of taste, yes, high, value of taste, high, so this is high, but this is very bad, therefore this value is very negative, so the next value is negative, I should say no. If you're someone who somehow underweights health, so you are not weighting that, you ignore it or you don't pay attention to it, you are more likely to end up assigning a high value to the ice cream and choose it. In other words, how you weight the attributes is going to matter a lot. And in fact, we have done a lot of work with dieters over the years. We bring dieters into the fMRI scanner here on campus, and we ask them to make choices among hundreds of different foods. Here are some examples there, that they have given us the indication of how healthy and how much they like it, but basically are how unhealthy. And there is a wide variation. People in blue are people who can self-control. People in red are people that cannot self-control. dietarily during the experiment. And what we find is that these people represent the attributes of these things differently in the areas that compute these various signals. So for example, this is this area of intermediate prefrontal cortex that encodes the values of the guide choice. People in blue who self-control represent both health and taste. People who cannot self-control only represent taste. Health is not there, as if health did not exist. Okay? And to the extent that they do that, this is what Klaus is saying, the more they're able to represent everybody, but the way represents taste. The difference is to what extent they're representing health. To the extent that they do, which is in the brain, is indicated here. Some measure of to what extent the value signal is responding to health. They are more able to make better self-control choices. So that's the second big point of the primer. And the final big point of the primer is this. These weights are not fixed. They are affected and modulated by attention and by cues on the environment. So in particular, we do an experiment in which we recruit people who are indicated they don't want to self-control. But we bring them to the lab and we ask them in a control condition to make choices just as before. And sometimes we ask them to choose whatever they want, but at the time they make the choice, consider how tasty the item is. And in other trials, we ask them, choose whatever you want, we show them food, but think about how healthy this thing is when you make the choice, and do whatever you want. And what we find is that changes the choices. So everybody says yes to healthy and tasty, and everybody says no to spam. That's like a universal constant on my field. I'm sorry if you own spam stock, but that's a fact. But when you do that attentional manipulation, you can get people to stop eating Snickers and make it more likely to eat things like Brussels sprouts. Okay? So you can manipulate choices by having cues in the environment or attentional cues that guide you to represent those attributes in the neural value signals in your decision-making system that guide the choice. End of the primer. And this is a summary of the things that I have been telling you. Now what I'm going to do is ask you, okay, are some of these key findings also going on in simple moral choice? I'm going to show you the results of 2 studies. I'll show you many others from my lab or from other groups, but these are 2 that illustrate this easily. This is a recent study we published. Consider the following task. I bring students to the lab, and we ask them to make choices between giving this amount of money to self and this amount of money to other, and that changes every trial, or every student gets $50, $50. So a very equitable thing, or one of them gets a lot more and the other one gets less. It's an altruism task, okay? And they do that hundreds of times, and for reasons that don't matter, sometimes we implement the trend, sometimes we flip it, but I'm not going to tell you about that. And this is, if you're curious, this is the type of choices that they make. So this is the reference. If they say, no, we don't want that choice, everybody gets 50-50 that trial. By the way, this is real money. At the end of the experiment, we select one trial and we give them $50 or what the person in the scanner chose in that trial. And these are the types of choices that they have to make. So sometimes they involve more money for self, but taking money for others. Sometimes they involve giving money yourself with respect to the reference, but the other person gets more money. And the percentage of the balls that are filled being the percentage of the time that the person making the choice is willing to do the generous thing, which is help the other. And you can see they are not willing to sacrifice a lot. They are not willing to sacrifice a lot if the other person gets little. Sorry, they are not willing to take a lot to take from the other person if the other person gets very little, etc. Just to get a sense that those trade-offs are there. But the most important thing here is this. It's a very simple model that explains the data, both neurally and behaviorally, with incredible accuracy. So I show you this screen, and I say, tell me yes or no. The average reaction times are going to be in the order of 2 to 3 seconds. This is a model that says, well, you're going to start the choice here, and whenever this signal crosses one of these pre-established barriers, you're going to make a choice. This is the barrier that says yes. Say yes to the choice, say no, and get the reference. There is this signal that is going to evolve with Gaussian noise. This is Gaussian noise. And the key idea is that this signal evolves as a linear combination of how much money I get over 50 plus how much money the other person gets over 50. Now, if you care equally between you and the other person, these 2 numbers are the same. If you don't care at all that the other person, this number is 0 and this number is positive. If you hate the other person's guts, this number is negative, okay, etc. But it's a very simple model. that it just tells you you have a diffusion model for lots of you that are in physics. You make a choice when you cross a barrier, and the key thing is that the average slope of that is a weighted sum of your payoffs plus the other person's payoffs. These weights tell you something about the relative weight that you put to yourself, attribute being paid to yourself versus the other. This model can explain, for example, the data very well. So this is the amount of donations that the model predicts versus the amount of observed donations, how long it takes to make decisions versus the amount of decisions. And these areas of ventromedial prefrontal cortex encode the value that you assign to the option that I'm giving you, the value of the payoff to self, and the value of the payoff to other. I'm showing you this because this is a case in which you have a very simple moral-like choice, altruistic decision, that is very well explained at many levels by a very simple model of pay attention to how much money the one person gets, how much money the other person gets, value those attributes by multiplying by your weight, and make a choice based on that. Work like a charm. I'm almost done. This is another study. Let's complicate the things a little bit to make it a little bit more interesting. So now we bring people also to the fMRI scanner, so we can measure the brain activity while they make choices. And we ask them to make this Jack Bauer. How many of you know who Jack Bauer is? Okay, the elderly in the audience, like me. Jack Bauer was big when I was your age. Okay. We put them in the scanner, and they're going to have to make choices like this. They're going to have to judge combinations like this, how morally acceptable they are. Like, would you forcibly remove organs from a young child to save the life of the President of the United States? Or would you waterboard a captured terrorist to save Los Angeles from a nuclear attack? These are moral conflicts. There is always a desirable outcome and a bad outcome, and the level on both differ, okay? Now, what we do is before they make these choices, we ask them to judge for each one of these things, either the good or the bad, none of them together, just this, and there are hundreds of them. How do they feel emotionally about this, from extremely negative to extremely positive? And also, what is the utilitarian rating for that thing? And by that we mean is how socially desirable is this outcome, like saving the life of the president or saving LA from a nuclear attack. And then we have those measures of their views on that independently for each individual, for every kind of component of these choices. We ask them to make choices. And what we find, for example, is that you can explain the choices extremely accurately as a weighted sum of the emotional ratings and the utilitarian ratings. It's as if when people see this, they decide how morally appropriate it is by taking the emotional rating, the utilitarian rating, weighting it up, and then expressing it to you. Again, it's an evidence of attribute computation, integration, to compute a value that drives something that really looks like moral behavior at that lower level. It's not every moral choice, but I mean, it's closer. And interestingly, remember this area of our old friend of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex that has these value signals that we have been seeing now for about 20 minutes? That encodes your moral rating, just as on the other tasks. And interestingly, if you ask, to what extent are the attributes that we were discussing showing in that area where you're making these choices, both emotional and the utilitarian is showing, but interestingly with a different time course. Your emotional rating, how emotionally appealing or unappealing were that component, as I described before, is there until you make a decision all the time. Your utilitarian rating takes a while to show up. It's not showing up with the same speed. That's what that is showing. Okay. This is very, very brief summary to stimulate discussion more than anything else. But there are hints. I wouldn't say these are the same choices, okay? But to me, there are hints in the literature, in my field, from cognitive neuroscience and other domains, that there are strong parallels between simple choices, the algorithms and the neural circuitry of simple choice, and those of moral choice. That there are some basic aspects of it that are preserved. It doesn't mean that they're identical, because, for example, you have to worry about where do these attributes come from, where do they come from, how do they show up. But at the end of the day, it looks like attribute computation, assignment into integration into a value signal in ventromedial prefrontal cortex that ends up guiding your choice. Now, I just want to finish with a couple of thoughts for you. One is, Okay, so this is a popular level summary of my science. What does it have to do for the topic of this very important group? I think that the link, if this is robust, the key link has to do with how the way you have been thinking about ethics, the way you're trained, primed, used to think about ethics and aspects of religion affect how you construct and value the attributes at the time of decision. So for example, if you are someone who is more likely to think about others or the consequence of what you're doing beyond yourself, that is going to change dramatically how you assign value in a task that involves trade between you and others, okay? And that's going to carry the choice. So I view any sort of ethical and moral training as having the potential through how these attributes are assigned, paid attention to, and valued to influence this basic circuitry to make choices. And I want just to conclude with a personal note. Look, I'm an atheist, okay? Trained in a Catholic school, and I'm sure a lot of my mentors will be disappointed, but I go with the science statement. But I believe, for example, in my personal experience, that these ideas have an impact. So anyone knows who this is? Marcus Aurelius, the last great emperor of Rome. Okay? He's very famous because he's the last of the Stoics, of the Stoic philosophers. And these guys, when I was in college, I read a lot of their work and have had a lifelong influence on me through the mechanisms that I'm talking about. By changing the way you interpret things in the environment, things that happen to you, how to think about the impact of your actions on others, it changes the way you end up valuing things, to me, in profound ways. And I could have taken this picture and put that of any other religious leader or mentor or leader that you have encountered in your life, and probably you will have, in a more personal basis, similar things. Thank you.
Well, that was a lot of fun. Thank you for that. I'm going to go in a very different kind of direction. That was very specific about how moral decision-making takes place and what some of the neural correlates are. But I think even though I'm going to take a very different approach to this, you're going to see some points of commonality, some points of overlap if you're looking for them. So I hope you do. My primary research area doesn't actually directly concern moral thought or moral decision-making, but is part of a cognitive science approach to why some ideas become more widespread than others, to the point that we might call them cultural. So I'm part of an area of work that's sometimes called the cognitive science of culture, or cognition and culture area, and specifically within that, I study religious thought. So where do religious thoughts come from? Cognitively, what is it about human minds that make us very receptive to certain types of thinking that we would call religious as opposed to others? And as I've worked in that area, I bump up against other research topics in the cognitive sciences, especially those that relate to cultural expression. And one of those areas is the cognitive and evolutionary science of moral thought. It turns out that the evolution of morality, or the psychology of morality, and the cognitive science of religion actually have a lot of parallels. That is, the cognitive mechanisms of human minds that seem to be at play that give us the sorts of moral beliefs that we have are very similar, in many cases, to the kinds of dynamics that we see in the formation of religious beliefs. And so I want to draw out some of those parallels for you. One of the sets of parallels concerns the relationship between beliefs and actions, or you might say broader than beliefs, other belief-like mental states, like attitudes, judgments, and thoughts. But I'm going to gloss those all as beliefs. One of the things that is sort of obvious common sense is that our beliefs impact our actions, right? I think You know, if I believe that there's a burrito in front of me, I'm more likely to act in such a way to consume it than if I don't believe that there's a burrito in front of me. If I believe that it's, what did we have up there, Spam, for instance. You're going to get some cross-cultural differences on that, though, if you look at Hawaiians in particular. So, you know. So, of course, in a common sense way, we say we form beliefs and those beliefs lead to certain kind of actions, but it's also the case that actions lead to beliefs. That one's less obvious, but those of you who've had some psychology, you know that this is the case too. We act ourselves into believing. And there are lots of sort of fun little ways to demonstrate this, but it's actually a kind of technique that advertisers have used on us for about, it's getting close to 100 years now, actually. Advertisers and salespeople. For instance, we use this kind of what's called foot in the door phenomena, where they'll get you to do something small for them. Could I come in and show you this product? And you're like, well, I don't care if you come in, that's all right. But you've already said yes to something. And what seems to be happening in your mind at that point is, well, they must not be so bad after all, or I wouldn't have let them in. I'm not saying that you consciously have that kind of an awareness, but somehow that you have acted in a receptive kind of way changes your attitude in a more receptive kind of way. And you can ratchet up beliefs this way. So little things that you didn't think you had a big commitment to, you can get a greater and greater commitment by acting your way into those beliefs. I won't go into that in any depth, but that's just another way in which our belief formation, whether they're moral beliefs or religious beliefs, how we act actually impacts what we believe. Maybe in some cases as much as how we believe impacts how we act. Okay? That might not be obvious. But then there is this sort of third way in which there are parallels between these two areas, and that is in that in many cases, our actions and our beliefs just seem to have a wall in between the two of them. Why do I act the way I do when it didn't fit my values or my beliefs? And I have in mind here areas of moral failing, for instance. The Apostle Paul in the book of Romans put it this way, I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but I do what I hate. It was kind of a vulnerable moment where he was reflecting on this sort of tension inside. But you don't have to go to, Long Dead Saints or anything to find this kind of dynamic. I was in CVS on Monday over here on Lake Avenue picking up a prescription. And you might know you have to line up and wait for the desk. And while I was sitting there, a mother came up behind me with two little kids. And they were all wound up because there's, the pumpkin festival thing out there in the parking lot at CVS. And so what I hear is, Mom, I'm going to go look at the toys. Me too. Okay, and the mom says, I don't want you running around. And they say, well, I'll try. And off they went. And I thought, that was a really revealing moment. I mean, the kid had the awareness to say, you know what? Whether I run around or not is kind of out of my control at certain points. I'll try as much as I can, but, Mom, all bets are off. And I don't think he was just being cheeky. One of the things that's cool about kids is sometimes they reveal things that are true of us as adults, too. But they're so much more unfiltered. It is the case that sometimes we want to do a certain type of thing. We want to make a certain kind of moral decision, and it just seems like we can't get our bodies to cooperate with it. What I'm pointing to there is that it seems like there's some kinds of dynamics going on within us that seem to be outside of our control, outside of our direct will. Well, what's going on there? It's not the case, at least it seems like, that in all situations we are a good, rational decision-making machine. And in fact, this has been a big movement in a lot of the study of both economic decision-making, but also in moral decision-making and other kinds of decision-making over the last 20 years or so, right? Is this real shift away from this model of thinking that we are perfectly controlled sort of rational evaluators of all of the relevant data out there, and then we make an informed, reasoned decision. It sometimes looks that way. I've got a philosopher postdoc sort of working in one of the groups that's part of my center at Fuller, and he's considering whether he wants to be a vegetarian. And so, of course, he's asking lots of questions about vegetarianism, about the environmental ethics of certain, of animal husbandry around certain kinds of animals, around the nutritional consequences, or around whether certain types of animals have the right kind of sentience to make them sort of have great moral value. He's sort of putting all of this in and trying to make an informed decision about whether he's going to become a vegetarian. He's weird, okay? And you might think, well, why is that weird? I do that. Well, you're weird too. Okay, most of us in this room are weird. You're at a very weird place doing very weird subjects because you're very weird people, in the best possible sense. Okay, most people don't live in their heads quite so much. Most of us actually make these kinds of decisions in another way. Let me give you an example of that. I once was an assistant track coach. One of my athletes on my team, after some event, we had pizza there, and I'm, all right, grab my pizza and start eating it, and he walks over and he goes, "How can you eat that?" Well, what? It's pepperoni pizza. It's wonderful. He said, "That's disgusting. It has swine on it." Oh. Do you know what they eat? I don't know. His reaction was visceral. It was a different kind of reaction. He doesn't eat pork. He's a Muslim. He was raised up in a way with the values that you don't eat pork. That's disgusting. And he could tell you exactly why it's disgusting. But I don't think his reaction was a reasoned reaction. His moral judgment about what I was doing had more to do with an emotional response, a visceral response. That's disgusting. Not, I've run the calculus and utility and trade-off is, no, it was just, that's disgusting. And that overwhelmed, right? It flipped the switch. A lot of what we consider our reasoning is actually informed by those kinds of intuitions, those emotional states. So then the question is, where do those kinds of emotional states, or I'm going to call them intuitions for lack of a better term, where do those come from? And that becomes a really interesting issue. You might think that there's a simple story to be told about that they simply come from enculturation. I did mention that this fellow was a Muslim, and part of his background was that you don't eat pork. Well, that's certainly part of the story. But if we start looking across cultures, and we start trying to figure out, well, what are the kinds of values that they are likely to have, not any old values are going to take. There's something behind those cultural values that are feeding into intuitions, that are feeding into decision making. Okay? It's too easy for us sometimes to think that our minds, how our mind brains, if you will, work, is just, they just kind of sponge up everything in the environment, very passively. But that's not how it works. Those of us who have been studying, say, early child development or looking at comparative cognition across species and so forth, are uncovering more and more evidence that that's just not how minds work. Humans have, like every species, natural predilections or tendencies or biases in terms of the kinds of things that they're going to easily acquire and learn. Some ideas are better to think. Some feelings are easier to feel. And that's really important. Because if some ideas are easier to think, they're easier to use to solve problems. If some ideas are easier to think, then they're easier to talk about. They're easier to share with other people. They're easier to persuade other people to believe. They're more likely to become distributed in the group. They're more likely to stabilize. They're more likely to become those ideas or values we call cultural. Do you follow me? Okay, so natural predilections of human minds actually inform and constrain the kinds of things we're likely to think, communicate, etc., which then constrains, it reduces the range of possibilities of those things that are likely to become cultural. Okay? And so then our range of possible values has shrunk from what it could possibly be. And that's interesting. So back to swine is disgusting. It's not for no reason that disgust was chosen there. That's a very natural reaction to foods. Foods, right, can be disgusting. It was morally loaded in that moment. But that's because some of our moral judgments have, as their kind of inference engine, their little emotional intuitions behind them, feelings like disgust. And really cool experiments have been conducted to show things like you are going to more harshly judge somebody's moral trespass if there's a bad smell in the room. All right? Somebody is more morally abhorrent if they stink. Weird, huh? It should have nothing to do with it. But those kinds of negative affective states actually do color our judgments, okay? And, okay, I was mentioning food. It's a very natural thing. As an omnivore, an omnivorous kind of animal like us, we need to make judgments about what kinds of things are dangerous and which aren't. And so it looks like it was probably a pretty good evolutionary gadget for us to form disgust mechanisms around certain kinds of foods that may have been dangerous. Because, you know, we're also sort of a mobile kind of group of people that moves all over the place, all right? And we have to learn from our environment and those who have come before us what's good to eat and what isn't. And it's generally not a good idea to just sample things as you go. You need to listen to what other people say. No, that's disgusting. Or no, that's poison. You better learn those fast. So that disgust kind of thing gets in deep, real early. Okay, there's a tuning up period in kids. It's really fun to see, right? You're like, okay, your average, 6-month-old, they're putting everything in their mouth. But what's mom and dad doing? They're walking behind them saying, no, that's disgusting. Ooh, yuck, no, you know, and fishing it out of their mouth with a hook. Down there. Okay, that's what they do. And then what you'll see, so Pise, wait for it, you know, when Ruben's a little bit older, he's got a 2-year-old now, he's real soon going to be moving into the, and now I don't let the peas touch the potatoes, because that's disgusting, right? He's going to overcompensate before he tunes back somewhere toward the middle. That disgust mechanism is being tuned up. That disgust mechanism can get hijacked to make moral decisions about people being disgusting, about behaviors being disgusting. Famously, and I'm sorry you've just eaten, but it's kind of fun anyway. It would be the guy from Fuller who uses examples like this. Famously, guys like Jonathan Haidt and others have used examples where we have strong, visceral, moral reactions to scenarios like, is it okay to have sex with a dead chicken? Most of us would go, no, that's wrong! But it's hard to rationally come up with reasons why. His argument, and I find this one actually reasonably compelling, is that our disgust response tells us no, okay? Just intuitively, and we don't need any reasons, thanks, you weird, creepy researcher, okay? The point with this very disturbing example is that we have certain kinds of intuitions that often have an emotional valence to them that probably arose for very good adaptive kinds of reasons in our species' evolutionary history that then inform the kinds of thinking that we're going to have in our space that then shapes the kind of culture that we're going to have too. Food taboos are all over the place. They're very common all over the world. They're one of the great ways to mark off boundaries between people groups, is how do you eat and what do you eat? Okay, you with me? All right. So instead of thinking about moral thought as a simple product of reasoning or of intuitions and emotions, it's helpful to recognize that both our reasoning and our intuitions are influenced by what I'm going to call natural cognition, both directly, and that some ideas are easier to think than others on an individual level, and via our culture that's also been shaped by those same mechanisms. And the same goes for religious thought. Religious thought is shaped by our reasoning and evidence, including experiences, and intuitions and emotions, but all of these are directly influenced by natural cognition. That sort of constrains the possibilities. And that constraining effect also influences cultural expression, which is another pathway in. I know that's complicated. I'm afraid the situation is more complicated. You did that too. You went complicated, then more complicated. So I'm going to do that. I like that. That's good. If we start thinking of both religion and morality from this kind of scientific approach, we very quickly figure out that the causal factors that lead to certain types of thought that we might be tempted to call moral, or certain types of thought that we might call religious, actually don't hold those categories together very well. The mechanisms, the causal mechanisms that lead to somebody thinking that pork is something you should not eat, morally should not eat, are different than the mechanisms that tell you that, well, murdering your mother is a bad thing to do. They're different psychological mechanisms, which are different still than deciding, I don't know, that it's meritorious to sacrifice yourself for your country, which is different than the mechanisms that relate to whether it's okay or not to graffiti a house of worship, or just how bad that is. That is, once we start looking at the psychology behind moral thought, we discover that that category morality actually starts falling apart as a useful category. And so does religion. Okay? The causal story, that's the kind of stuff I do, is all right, what are the causes for religious thought? Are actually very different for why people might believe in an ancestor spirit versus why they might believe in a cosmic deity, or why they might believe in a soul, or why they might believe in karma. They're actually different causal pathways. They're not the same. They make use of ordinary common psychological mechanisms. I'm not saying that there's a special sort of cognitive system for God beliefs. I don't think that's the case. Just within those sort of common psychology that we have, there's nothing really unifying about, say, ancestor spirits and gods versus afterlife beliefs, etc. Nor are all of these things that we think of as moral domains necessarily all the same. Okay, this is my quick shorthand way of saying that from a scientific perspective, morality probably isn't a very useful category. It's a good heuristic category, but it's not a good scientific category. And neither is religion. It's a little bit like a tree in that respect. Right? Anybody studying botany, you know botanists don't have much time for trees. Landscape, it's all right, use trees as a category, but as a botanist, tree, not very meaningful category, it turns out. Right? You with me? Okay, why does that matter? Well, then if we turn to these kinds of big questions, like, well, do you need to be religious to be moral? It's just so vague as to be not helpful. Because there's this big cloud of things that we're sort of gesturing toward as moral, and this big cloud of things that don't causally hang together that we're calling religious, and then we're trying to do a one-to-one mapping between these. I just don't find that very helpful. What we need to do is get very specific. We need to ask about things like, well, is living as a devout Mennonite associated with being less likely to commit acts of physical violence? Okay, notice what I did there? I drilled down to a very specific kind of religious affiliation, belief system, participation, identity, and a very specific kind of behavior that you might want to say is a moral kind of consideration. And once we get down to that level, well, then we can make some pretty good predictions. Yeah, all right, Mennonite, they're pacifists. They generally don't go out and beat people up. Those Mennonite street gangs and all of that, it just doesn't really happen. Being a committed Catholic is probably going to make you a little bit more likely to think that divorce is not merely sort of unfortunate, but it's actually immoral. Being a Hindu is going to make you more likely to not select the barbacoa in the back because that was beef. All right? Make sense? Notice, though, that I'm using this language of more likely. Because, of course, in the human sciences, unlike those of you who have the pleasure of working in physics and things like that, we're dealing with very partial and probabilistic kinds of models. I never get data as clean as yours either. I mean, that was some awesome stuff. It brings a tear to my eye and a little bit of envy. if I get an R squared of 0.4, I'm just over the moon. Heck, I'd take a 0.2 most days. But so I guess what I want to impress upon you is if we're going to have a useful discussion about questions like, well, do you need to be religious, or do you need to be religious to be moral? I think the question's at the wrong level. What we want to do is drill down to things like, well, what do you mean by morality? Which particular types of normative judgments are you concerned about? Which are the ones you're counting as morality or not? And what in the world do you mean by religious? Let's drill down on that a little bit too. And I think once we do that, we'll get beyond just sort of coalitional type of thinking about, are you religious or not, which is too crude. Are you moral or not? That's even worse in some ways. Okay? And then we can actually start doing not only better science, but have more fruitful conversations around this space as well. But I better stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Barrett, I'll actually have you stay right there, and Dr. Rangel, I'll have you come up. I'm just struggling to wrap my mind around so many great things, and I took up a million notes, and I can't wait to unpack some of this by the way, we put the videos online for anyone who wants to watch the talks again and get another pass at understanding all these concepts or follow up on anything. But so what we're going to do right now is just allow these guys a little opportunity to ask each other questions and say any follow-up comments. And I might pop in with a prompt question. But since Dr. Barrett just did his talk, we'll have Dr. Rangel start. And feel free to make any comments or ask a question if you'd like to.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. I really found them. I was taking notes like a student. I want to ask you a question about something you said. I thought it would be interesting for discussion for the group. And I'm going to use a mixture of my language and yours to meet on the middle. So the way I think about a part of what you said is that there are cognitive propensities to find more some attributes and values assignments to there, or ways of framing problems or situations, just frame it like that, easier to occur than others, and that once you realize that, if you could pin that down nicely, you could understand why we see some types of value systems versus others more often. And you gave the example of food, which is beautiful. I would imagine that another typical example would be insiders versus outsiders, us versus them. It's a prevalent theme in the United States right now. And the question that I wanted to ask you in that context is the following, which is, the logic that I heard you say is that the things that are easier for us to acquire, like this food disgust, or my group versus the others, will likely to end up becoming, in your language, intuitions. In my language, it's emotional drivers of the decisions that are going to have a lot of power because they have to be overcome by some other type of attribute or process to stop. And if you look at history, it sounds to make sense, but don't you look around these days, for example, and see a lot of, especially these young people, that actually, if anything, they have the opposite automatic reactions, which is that the others are, the emotional reaction to the others is warmer than to the ones to the group, to the inside group, which would suggest that some of these cognitive constraints are less constraints that we may have thought over the long term. It's a very open-ended question. I would be curious to hear your thoughts.
Good, thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. I don't want to suggest that all of the cognitive constraints are sort of equally constraining, right? I think they have different properties in terms of their tuning up. So even this sort of disgust mechanism, right, depending on what you're exposed to during these sort of sensitive periods of development, you can have a broader or narrower range of which things you think of as disgusting. And even in terms of, well, what markers am I going to use to decide who's in my in-group versus out-group? no doubt that there is a tuning up period in that as well. And I want to note, because I think it does come up a lot with this, is it's quite so that there's something very natural about marking about who's my group and who isn't. That really does seem to be something that kids do pretty quickly. I want to note that it does not look like the markers that we adults in the United States use for race categories are actually among the strongest markers that kids are gravitate toward. And if you stop and think about that a little bit, it kind of makes sense. If this is somehow a deep evolutionary mechanism, if you go back not very long, people didn't run into people who looked radically different from them. That didn't mark in-group and out-group. What did? How they talk was a huge marker. Word choices, rhythm of language, because you go over the next mountain range and people can talk differently than you do. Okay, so actually little kids have been shown that if you give them a preference, who are they going to listen to, who are they going to trust? Somebody who sounds like them but looks different versus looks like them but sounds different. They're going to pick somebody who looks different but sounds like them. Okay, so those kinds of in-group, out-group markers that we as adults might gravitate towards are not necessarily the most natural ones on a certain level. And it is also the case that kids, of course, are going to be plastic in this, maybe more plastic than adults. So I think it's a great question. Yeah.
I have another question, but I wanted to give you a chance if there was a topic you wanted to discuss to bring it up.
Well, I mostly wanted to draw attention to, I think that one of the distinctions you were making, especially in your second study that you were putting up, actually mapped onto some of the things that I was suggesting. And so I want to make sure that I've got it right. Because it looked to me like your utilitarian ratings, right, those were the slow ones when you drew the curve, whereas the emotional ratings were the fast ones. So my reading or understanding, you're right, that the utilitarian ratings, they would be slower because you're having to do sort of a reasoned sort of calculus on that. What are the, because when we think in utilitarian terms, right, we're weighing certain goods versus certain ills, and we have to do that kind of work, and that's just slower work to do than the emotional valuation. Am I understanding that right?
The intuition is that, but it's not actually a thing about, for the utilitarians, you have to span and frame the scenarios and weight them. If you look at the difference in reaction time when you ask people you show them the scenarios to provide an emotional judgment on a utilitarian rating, they are on the order of 300-400 milliseconds.
Oh, that's
the difference
fast.
is the difference.
Yeah.
They take about a second and a half and 1.8 seconds, more or less. So the difference is relatively fast. Also, you can do mouse tracking studies. I didn't show you data on that. And you see that, again, there is a gap, but I don't think it's driven by a conscious gap. It's just that some attributes, conscious or unconscious, take longer to process and show up and also neurally in the value signals. Yeah. But I think, by the way, we use different language, but I think the fundamental ideas are the same. I do think that this, what I would call an emotion, or these intuitions that you're talking about, that show up very quickly and influence the decision. And there is another line of work from other people that you may find interesting in the audience, which is that imagine two people that have I asked them, like your friend who had this reaction against pork, I asked them, would you eat this piece of pork to save that child? Okay, they're in an extreme situation. If they have to make a decision incredibly fast for whatever reason, the emotional is going to drive the choice. If you give more time, then the other consideration, it's not that it stops the emotion is still, or the intuition attribute is still there, but it has time to correct the other thing, much like the health and taste analogy. So slowing down, for example, or training that allows you to have these non-intuitive considerations either become intuitive themselves or enter faster can have a profound impact on all kinds of decisions, including these types of moral-looking choices.
So I wonder, I mean, it sounds like then if your advice to us would be that if we want to be able to override the real visceral kinds of responses to things, to be able to draw more evidence in, we just need more time to make those decisions and maybe be less distracted and otherwise have less, well, in my field we'd say have less cognitive load in some ways. Right?
Cognitive load, definitely. No, I actually, these links, maybe I can ask you the other question that ties with this point clearly, and it may also be interesting for discussion with the audience. You know, I couldn't agree more with you that when you look at the last 50 years of psychology, economics, neuroscience, this idea of rational self that can systematically compute information just breaks apart in many, many of the domains of interest. But I go even further, that once you take these types of frameworks seriously, the notion of the self itself becomes very tricky to think about. I mean, it's not like you have these intuitions and then yourself, whatever that is, can stop them. It's just there are other cognitive processes that show up and compete with each other. And the reason I'm saying this is because, to me, when I look at the body of evidence on problems of self-control, in social moral domains, in food domains, in saving domains, in doing your homework domains, I think more important than exercise self-control is developing what I would call the right cognitive habits. So the idea is that if you, for some reason, your systems can bring out these other considerations faster and have them matter, the self-control problem disappears because you're never tempted to do the wrong thing in the first place. And I wanted to ask you first, what do you think about the importance of this training to think about things in a certain way and fast? And these are really going to become cognitive habits, the role of repetition, all of this, and the role of religion more generally in those things. In one of your reviews that I had the pleasure of reading today, for example, you review studies by others in which a reminder of religion engages more prosocial behavior. And it could be, for example, that I would bet you that in those studies, if I were to do the types of measurements that I do, we would find that when you have these cues, people actually are able to compute the attributes for another person and take it into account in the decision-making circuitry faster.
Yeah, it can sound really pessimistic if we, on one level, if we're both suggesting that certain kinds of quick decision-making anyway feels like it's entirely out of our control. So what then? Are we just sort of, but I'm with you on this. I think that what it suggests is that we use our self-control judiciously to make decisions to create new habits so that we don't have to use it.
That's beautifully said.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think faith traditions at their best, that's what they ought to be doing, is pointing us in. I sounded like, oh, there are all of these intuitions that are completely driving who we are, how we think, well, it's a lot more influential than we think. But that's why we need to use our rational reason kind of thinking to put ourselves in situations that train up other ways of thinking and behaving. We need to, and this is why I think it's hard to be a religious person all by yourself, we need to be part of communities too that are going to pressure us in certain ways that are virtuous. Okay, so that's part of it as well. And we're naturally a conforming kind of herd animal. I mean, look at you all. You're just sitting there quietly looking at us. Any other primate, it would be bedlam in here. People throwing stuff and tearing each other apart, but you're
You know there is a little bit of gorilla in them too, right? So you may want to watch out for the comparison.
But part of that is that we are conforming animals. Well, then let's choose to put ourselves around people who are going to bring out the best in us and not the worst in us, right? So that's part of that decision making. Uh-oh, I touched on something.
No, you guys are awesome. The only thing I want to do is I do want to give a little time for audience questions for both of our speakers. And so if you guys would just stay up for another moment and please raise your hand if you've got a question. And, all right. This is the first hand up right here. So.
Thank you both very much for your talk, really interesting. Both of you kind of touched on, I think, the question of free will and many different theories of morality or of economics have contained within them assumptions about free will. So we might say a lot of forms of Christianity say that people are free to act. Did everyone hear what I said so far? Okay, so I wanted to ask about about free will. So lots of different theories, many theories of Christianity, of economics, of justice have this idea of us as being able to make free choices in a way kind of unencumbered by these external influences in some sense. And thus, when we make these choices, we should be held personally responsible. We should be punished or rewarded for those choices. And I'd like for you to speak as how that interfaces with what you've been saying, which I think a lot of it leads in the direction of saying we don't really have free will in the way we commonly conceive it, and that seems to have pretty profound implications for the way we think about punishment and the way we think about moral responsibility. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right. At least typically, when we think about moral judgments, we presume that there's a certain amount of free will. Moral culpability seems to require something like a concept of free will. Is it different than maybe we have previously thought? Yeah, I think it is. I think the science on all levels of the human sciences over the last 50 years have made us recognize just how creaturely we are. We are encumbered in many ways. Does it eliminate free will? I don't think so. I like to think of it a little bit like, I like to play basketball. I'm free to play basketball. I'm free to do certain things on the court. I'm free to shoot. I'm free to dribble. I'm free to rebound. I'm not free to dunk. I lost that ability many decades ago. So there's certain encumbrances, but they don't eliminate my freedom. But they should, I hope, when I'm playing with others, garner a little bit of sympathy and a little bit of grace for my limitations. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is that while we may want to, and we may need to, hold people morally culpable for the decisions that they make, there's something prudent about taking into consideration, well, what are the encumbrances that that person is dealing with? And I think we have that intuition, right? We don't hold a 2-year-old culpable in the same way that we hold a 30-year-old for similar kinds of behaviors. If a 30-year-old throws a tantrum, the same way a 2-year-old does, we think, all right, you need to pull it together, buddy. Because I think we do have an intuitive understanding about these encumbrances. What the science, I think, is helping us see is, well, more of them. And maybe it's going to make us more gracious with each other.
Yeah, I mean, these are questions for the ages. I'm going to give you a 1-minute answer. I think that the common intuition of what free will is makes no sense. And that's the problem, not free will by itself. You're a biological machine. We have to bite the bullet, we all are. The more important question is whether that machine is predictable or not. And I think, we are very early on, but one day we're going to write models as a scientific community that will predict every individual and with high stochastic accuracy. It doesn't change the fact that there is freedom of choice if you define it in the following way, and you're welcome to roll your eyes at the answer. You're telling me, dunking is a great example of violating the laws of nature, but for most other things that you do, you say, I wouldn't do that because, my algorithms or my preference will lead me in that way. But I can also get you not to do it or to push the direction in the other direction by changing the circumstances. So for example, like your friend, would you eat pork? No. What about for $1,000? No. What about for $5,000? No. What about for $10,000? Yes, and then I can donate $10,000 to a charity that I want. You know what I mean? That is telling you there is a great degree of behavioral flexibility that is predictable. So if you take the idea that, you can even take a very weak position that as long as I could get you to flip your behavior by changing the conditions, you had freedom of choice. It just happens to weigh the things differently. The problem disappears. The dunking is an interesting one because now you're talking about constraints of things that no matter what you would ever do. So suppose you have someone that no matter what, you put them a gun in their hands, they're going to shoot the first person in front of them, no matter what, then you're in the donking case, and I think that you have an argument, but for most other circumstances, it's not an issue. It's an issue for the popular notion, but not for the concept, to me.
Any other questions? Time for one more.
I'm sorry, I cannot hear you.
You said that human predilections determine the cultural ideas that get circulated around. So I'm guessing that humans haven't changed that much or evolved that much in their minds. How does it explain the social progress we have over the past decades if those morals or ideas are from human predilections?
I apologize. I'm extremely hard of hearing. I cannot hear. I'm so sorry.
Jeff, could you try to?
I think she was saying if our our brains have certain predilections, moral predilections, how might we then think of what you might think of moral progress that gets made, for instance, in recent decades? Is that something new, or is that somehow also rooted in our history of our minds? Is that what you're trying to say?
Good, great. Is progress possible? Well, sure. Let me draw an analogy actually with science, since we're at one of the great science institutions in the world. Science is really hard. Maybe you've noticed. Not many people can do it, and yet here you are. But how do you manage to do that? Well, we've developed languages of mathematics, different technical language. We've developed institutions. We've developed external memory devices called books, among others, that actually act as sort of cognitive prosthetics for us. We use the jargon of cultural scaffolding that help us get beyond the sort of natural kind of predilections and limitations that we have as individuals. And it's not for no reason that you're here as, with lots of colleagues, because that's part of the cultural scaffolding too. It's easier to do stuff as a collective than it is as individuals. So let me suggest that moral progress, and theological progress for that matter, may actually be a function of similar kinds of dynamics, where we can get beyond our certain individual kinds of limitations by building sort of cultural scaffolding around us. That doesn't mean it isn't going to be hard work. It's still going to be hard work because it's so unnatural in some cases. So we may need to slow things down, or we may need to develop very deliberate, intentional habits of thought and practice to ease things up on us, to make that kind of progress. And that's going to be hard in some cultural environments. It really is. We're very privileged in many respects that we can step back from these things and have conversations like this instead of just being in the midst of survival where we have to make decisions very quickly. Do you follow the analogy? And I think that's how moral progress is possible, at least one of the ways.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more pessimistic, and let me explain why. Look, I think that you can easily see areas within the self, within groups, within institutions, within countries, across countries, that there has been moral progress. I think there will be a wide consensus. I just believe that that progress is extremely unstable and very, very fragile. The person who coined the crooked timber of humanity sentence was onto something. I think that we were not wired evolutionarily. Our cognition is not wired naturally without a lot of support from culture, from institutions, from training, from others, to consistently do the right thing. And things can go bad very quickly. I am hopeful, though, that we are going to enter a period in the not too far future, a period that many of you may contribute to, of human reengineering. And it's scary in a number of ways, obviously. We don't have to spell them out. But I also see tremendous opportunities for strengthening our I just call them broadly moral and ethical capabilities, because otherwise the future looks scary to me.
Actually, I don't want to sound too optimistic. I said moral progress is possible, not inevitable. And I think you're right about that. One of the problems with actually cultural scaffolding is it can be an amplifier for whatever the base signal is. And so if it's really evil, it can become more evil too, right?
One of the things that I wonder if you have had this experience, like I'm 48, and I sometimes think about, because I hang out so much with students at Caltech, about myself as a Caltech undergraduate 25 years ago. So I tell you, one of the things that has changed for me the most is a great respect for great institutions and cultural norms. They take centuries to build and moments to destroy. And it's because of reasons like this, because we need this extra help to guide us, to train us, to help us bring out the better angels in our nature.
Well, that's actually a great place to leave it, and we thank you guys so much. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question, you might be able to catch these guys coming around these tables a little bit, and let's just give it up for these guys.